so President Bush, when he asked if I would do this, the question that I had for him was, is this just your family office? Because if it's just your family office, you sure don't need me. But he said, no. I said, we have great momentum. We've had great leadership in the past. I really want this to live long past our time here. I said, that's an interesting strategic question. How do we make a place that has a certain a man's name on the door? How do we make that perpetual?
Hello and welcome to Conversations for Good. I'm John Olajide, founder and CEO of Axxess, a Dallas-based company that's a leader in home healthcare technology. In 2020, I served as chair of the Dallas Regional Chamber of Commerce. The idea of using business as a force for good is something that I am deeply passionate about. Conversations for Good brings together business leaders, community leaders, and entrepreneurs who embody what it means to use business as a force for good. Today, I am pleased to welcome Ken Hersh, President and CEO of the George W. Bush Presidential Center. Ken, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, before we talk, I'd like to share a bit of Ken's impressive background. Before joining the George W. Bush Presidential Center as CEO in 2016, Ken spent 28 years as co-founder and CEO of NGP Energy Capital Management. During that time, he became one of the nation's leading private equity firms, managing more than $20 billion in assets. Ken is also very involved in nonprofit and humanitarian efforts through his work with the Hersh Foundation and service on the boards of the Global War on Terrorism Memorial Foundation, the Communities Foundation of Texas, and the Advisory Council of the Asian American Foundation, among lots of other things that he does. Ken, you are a remarkable example of service and using one's voice for good.
Well, I'm just trying to do the best I can. There's lots of wonderful organizations that are doing fantastic work, and if I can pitch in and help, I'm happy to.
You know, what you'll hear from our conversation today is Ken is rather modest, in fact, very modest about all he's accomplished, but I'm going to try to pull out a lot of details from him today that the audience can enjoy. So let's get right to it. Okay, Ken, so I've been researching you, and I read that one of your frequent sayings is that every plant needs to be repotted. What led to your shift from working in the energy sector to working at a nonprofit?
Well, I think that it was a number of factors really that hit me all at the right time. The private equity industry has gone through a series of transformations in the last decade, really ever since the global financial crisis. And that business itself has matured, and it's become a lot more complicated. It's become a lot more regulated, and from somebody who's been in that business when there was no such thing as a private equity industry, starting it with my partners in 1988, it really has morphed into an industry that has just a whole different set of dynamics. So it's a long-winded way of saying that it was a lot less fun, but it wasn't not rewarding. It was just a different kind of business than the business I entered. And I moved past my 50th birthday, and that also hit me at a time personally where I was getting a whole lot more enjoyment out of my philanthropic work, sitting on boards, being really involved in the community. I just had so much joy in that part of my life. And so I started to think about Chapter 2.0. And that's really, I didn't go looking for an opportunity, but when I found something that was national in scope, it was mission driven with a mission that I agree with. It involved people who I admired and looked up to, and it happened to be in my hometown. I mean, and so when the Bush Center came calling, it was just a really logical thing for me to consider. And I was honored to be asked, and even more honored to serve.
Well, Ken, thank you for your opening comments there. And you've let our audience know about the work that you're doing leading the Bush Center now, and I know you're doing remarkable work. And we cannot talk about the Bush Center without talking about 9/11. In many ways, the terror attacks of 9/11 defined the presidency of George W. Bush. So 20 years after that, tell us, how does the Bush Presidential Center view that event, and its impact on our country?
Well, I think one of the lessons, the lasting lesson of 9/11 is what happens over there matters over here. And there is no substitute for American leadership abroad. And just because you're not interested in a part of the country doesn't mean that part of the world doesn't mean that part of the world isn't going to be interested in you. So we were attacked, and it was not an attack on the brick and mortar of New York City and Washington, D.C. It was an attack on the way we live here in the United States, things that we take for granted, our freedoms, the way we treat women, capitalism, opportunity, accountability, compassion. These are values that have been essential parts of the American experiment. And there's a big group of people that are threatened by what we take for granted. And those people planned an intricate, premeditated attack aimed at not just the symbols of our way of life, but at our way of life. And so I think that, President Bush, as you said, that changed his presidency. 8 months into his presidency, he became a wartime president, and he knew it on that day. And so, our job here is to perpetuate the values of freedom, opportunity, accountability, and compassion. It's to perpetuate the value of America as a force for good in the world. It's to emphasize and remind people of what leadership looks like, what principled leadership looks like. Whether you agreed or disagreed with President Bush during his presidency, you never thought that he was doing something that was to make him wealthier or to preserve something that was a pet of his. I mean, nobody would doubt that when he decided something, it was for what he thought was in the best interest of the country. Yeah. And that principled leadership are lessons that permeate today and really need a champion. And so the Bush Center, we aim to be a home for the values that define this country: economic and political freedom, less government dependency, and being a strong and compassionate country at home and abroad. Well, a lot of that came out of 9/11.
Well, very well said. You mentioned leadership, and you also mentioned being a force for good, and we'll touch on those some more throughout this conversation. But for the audience, I just want to share that if you're enjoying this conversation, please like and share this video, and be sure to subscribe to join us in future conversations on how business and how you can be a force for good. So Ken, I want to stay on 9/11, talking about being a force for good. We know now it's a day of reflection and a day of service as Patriot Day. So talk some more about the importance of this day and how someone, or anyone, can take such a moment and use it for good, and even share some examples of what you have done personally and that the Bush Center has done in this regard.
Sure. I think that 9/11 was a terrible event in New York City and Washington, D.C. But the aftermath of 9/11 saw an incredible rallying of Americans for and with fellow Americans.
Yes. And
there was an incredible outpouring of support for New York City, for Washington, D.C., for our veterans, for our military, and really for a lot of public servants, but also really there was a sense of community. There was we all remember the contentious 2000 election and the Florida recount. And so the country was very, very split at the time. But imagine that within a week, President Bush's approval ratings went into the high 80s. There was an incredible coming together. And there was a feeling that, when you're attacked, personal differences have a funny way of melting away.
Yes.
And so the aftermath brought a lot of renewed spirit to philanthropy, to community service, to helping others. When you saw your friends or people that were friends of your friends running in the rubble covered with ash, looking like ghosts covered in white ash, running from the collapsing buildings, it didn't matter if you were a food service worker or the titan of Wall Street. Those buildings came down on you, and it doesn't know who you are and where you
Right.
live.
And it didn't matter what the politics was either.
That's right, or your politics. So I think that is one of the reminders that I hang on to. That even in an age of dysfunction and division that we live in now, there are lots and lots and lots of examples of people doing well and doing good and helping each other in their communities. And I like to focus on that because that really is the essence of what this country is. This country is not a top-down country. This country is a bottom-up country. And it starts on the sidewalks and in your neighborhoods and in your personal relationships and builds up from there. So that, that to me has been, really one of the enduring lessons. So you ask what we do at the Bush Center. I mean, we talk about a call to service. We talk about how we can inspire. We talk about how we can lead and demonstrate. So we do things internally here. We have community service days, and we are ourselves philanthropic. We encourage people also in their spare time to get involved in the community, so that we are an outwardly facing organization. Even though, as a think tank, we can't be everywhere and we can't do everything. But we can set the examples that we can, and we can deliver the messages. So we try to do that at every step.
Excellent. So let's talk about one of my favorite subjects, and I know you care a lot about it as well, and you've mentioned that earlier in your comments, leadership. So Ken, talk for a minute about your leadership approach, and as you think about it, the impact that you're having on an institution like the Bush Presidential Center.
Well, I mean, my feeling is that for me, the most important impact that I can have as a leader is to serve the people who are working here so that they can do their job better. And I can be their head cheerleader. And, if I can handle being the cheerleader for the mission and the values and the priorities, then assembling a great team that has built a lot of corporate culture and a great trust network amongst the people here, then everything will take care of itself. So I spend a lot of time on culture. I spend a lot of time on teamwork and trust. And to me, there's no substitute. There's no substitute for culture. COVID has tested us, but when COVID hit, that was not the time for you to work on your communications as an organization. You need to build trust. You need to build good communication skills. You need to build good teamwork. You need to build a good culture when you don't need it, because that's the easiest time to build it.
Yep.
And then when you need it, you can lean on it. And so when we got spread to the wind because we're working remotely, when we were having life circumstances which caused people to have to cover for each other, I mean, that's the kind of stuff that you can't just fiat at the time. You had to build it. So my leadership management style is to focus on the big stuff: culture, communication, and trust. And then to make sure that the employees here and the team here feels valued, and that they all know which direction we're going. If that happens, then I'm highly confident the outcome will be great.
Interesting. We'll talk about culture in just a moment. But when you've done all that and lead the way you're leading, Ken, what would you like your legacy to be when you're done serving in this role? And I don't know how long that'll be, but when it's all said and done, what would you like your legacy leading the Bush Center? What would you like that legacy to be?
Well, my legacy is very much about trying to establish the Bush Institute as a leading thought leader around the topics that we work in this country. It's establishing our programmatic work so that it'll last long into the future. It's making sure we have a financial base that can support this place far into the future with a strong endowment and a strong following. And then most importantly, that people want to come listen to what our experts are saying, and our experts want to come work here. So President Bush, when he asked if I would do this, the question that I had for him was, is this just your family office? Because if it's just your family office, you sure don't need me. But he said, no. I said, we have great momentum. We've had great leadership in the past. I really want this to live long past our time here. I said, that's an interesting strategic question. How do we make a place that has a man's name on the door? How do we make that perpetual?
That's not easy.
It's not easy, right? And so that, to me, it's a strategy question. So building a strong culture, building a great track record with good programs and thought leadership and a good financial base has all the ingredients. And so, having an endowed fellows program and having wonderful policy experts who are quoted, who are print published, who, policymakers seek out, that creating that franchise, if you will, is an extension of the Bush values. And that's something that can live far into the future. So to me, I hope that my legacy here is really perpetuating those values that the Bushes the Bushes built their public service on: freedom, opportunity, accountability, compassion. Those are values that really mean something to the Bushes and to me as well. And then if there's priorities of the Bushes, and this place will always be about working on their priorities, but also new priorities, because the challenges of the year 2050 will be different than the challenges of the year 2020.
Absolutely.
And so, but around freedom and opportunity, and if you approach the problems of the day with those principles, then it's a good compass. And so my hope is to really solidify this place as a place where those values have a home, independent of the heartbeat of the Bushes.
Got it. Well, congrats on all your success. You're well on your way in that regard. I can attest to that. Thank you for your leadership. Now, you talked about culture earlier, and I told you I was going to come back to that. That's something that's very important to me, and it's obviously very important to you, and particularly workplace culture. At Axxess, we're invested in what we call the Axxess way. And in your case, throughout the course of your career, I want to know what you think has worked best in keeping employees engaged and invested in what they're doing.
Well, the most important thing is to make sure they feel valued. There's lots of different currencies that you can use. Currency is a good one. So compensation needs to be competitive within the markets that you serve or that your employee base fits in. But it's not just cash. When I was a younger capitalist, I thought that you could pay people and if you pay them enough, they'll do what you want, and that's not necessarily the case. And it may help for a while, but it's not sustainable in the long run. And so I think that from a managerial perspective, you need to make sure that your employees feel valued. You need to make sure that they feel heard. You need to make sure that they feel a part of the mission. Okay, that it doesn't mean that the mission is negotiable, but that they are part of the execution of the mission. And the days of being a didactic top-down leader, those days are over. It takes a really, really strong person to do that. And unless you're the smartest guy in the room and everybody says this guy invented the secrets and he invented the product and he knows it better than anybody, I mean, that may be one way to do it, but at the end of the day, the next crop of people coming up are way smarter and they'll just bump off the guy at the top and say, I'm the new smart guy in the room. So I don't like the smartest guy in the room model, because I don't think that's sustainable. I think that the role of a leader is to empower the people on the team and to make them feel valued, make them understand they're an important part of the process. And then very importantly is to feed the winners. And your organization, every organization has stars. And in my opinion is focus on the stars, and those people who want more responsibility, who want to achieve and excel and advance, focus on them. Too often the squeaky wheel gets the grease, brings the whole organization down. And I'm not saying ignore the problems that you have, but minimize the problems by feeding the winners. And the problems have a way of rectifying themselves.
Ken, I just love your answers. And I know there are lots of leaders listening in here to this conversation. That's very powerful. So now, last question for you. Other than obviously President George W. Bush that you admire and look up to, what other leader in history or in contemporary times do you admire, and why?
You didn't have that question on the list. That's a new one. I admire so many different people for different reasons. But given that this is a business conversation, one of the early mentors, and I had the benefit of being around Richard Rainwater in our office with him for 11 years. He passed away a handful of years ago, tragically. But it was a real honor and a gift to be around him for the length of time that I was. His personality was electric. His mind was fast. He valued people. He made you feel like you were the only one in the room, regardless of how many people were in the room. And he always had something nice to say, and people loved to be around him. He drew energy from people, and I just have always admired the way he was able to get people to think and feel that they could achieve almost anything. And I was one of those people, and I kind of did something at a young age, and he said, "Go for it," and that was unusual back in the 80s.
Wow.
So
Wow.
I'd say that Richard doesn't really get the people who've known him and were lucky enough to be around him would echo this, but he didn't call a ton of attention to himself. Rarely traveled out of Fort Worth, Texas. Had a few articles written about him, but it just wasn't a big part of his life to get a lot of notoriety. And he was just a special guy, and I miss him.
Wow, wow, wow. Thanks for sharing that. Ken, thank you so much for your time. This has been a fascinating conversation, and thank you for everything that you do to make the world a better place.
Thank you, and thank you for what you do to make the world a better place. You are an example of what is great in the world, not just in this country. But your story as well is fantastic, and I'm proud to have you as a friend.
Ken, you're very kind. The feeling is very, very mutual. Thank you for joining us today. If you've enjoyed this conversation, please like and share this video, and be sure to subscribe to join us in future conversations on how business can be a force for good. Thank you to those tuning in. I look forward to many more great conversations in the future as we all work together to make our communities better and a better world for all. Thank you.